introduced at the third round of the 1971 Formula 1 World Championship, the Lotus 72D would prove to be the definitive variant of the revolutionary Lotus 72. The Lotus 72 had already proved its mettle by the time that the D model was introduced, having secured its maiden championship in 1970 at the hands of the late Jochen Rindt. Whilst the 72D would have a mediocre 1971 season, it would more than prove its worth in the hands of Emerson Fittipaldi for the 1972 season, with the Brazilian maestro single-handedly winning both championships that year, scoring 4 victories and 3 other podiums on his way to 61 points in both championships. The 72D would also compete in the first 3 rounds of the 1973 season, with Fittipaldi picking up 2 more victories and a 3rd place before the car would be replaced by the 72E, a car that seemed much better suited to Fittipaldi's teammate Ronnie Peterson. The Lotus 72 would pick up its final victories in the 1974 season, and although it would also contest the 1975 championship, it was completely outclassed and would be replaced for 1976. Yet again designed by the legendary Colin Chapman, the Lotus 79 would be the first Formula 1 car to take full advantage of ground effect, completely outclassing every other car in the 1978 season, aside from a certain Brabham, that is. The 79 would only make its competitive debut at round 6 in Monaco, where it trounced the entire field in the hands of Mario Andretti. It would then go on to score 2 1-2s in the next 3 rounds, when Ronnie Peterson got his hands on the machine. The 79 wasn't without its issues. It tended to overheat, and it wasn't the most reliable of cars. But whenever it was reliable, it was typically the fastest on the track, picking up 6 race victories across the 1978 season, adding to those that had already been won by its predecessor, the 78. The 79 would also contest the 1979 season, but by this point it was outclassed, and ultimately this would be the last truly successful Lotus, picking up the final Drivers' and Constructors' Championships that Lotus ever had, and being the last Lotus to even win a race for another 4 years. By 1986, Colin Chapman had passed away, and the team was clearly in decline, but they would still see some moderate success, especially with this, the 98T, driven by Ayrton Senna and Johnny Dumfries. Dumfries was next to useless, so the vast majority of the car's success came at the hands of Ayrton Senna, who had already proven that he was an exceptional talent, as he managed to drag the Renault-powered car to 2 Grand Prix victories that season. The 98T was a quick car, but its Renault engines were not the most reliable. This fact, plus the dead weight of Johnny Dumfries, prevented the car from finishing any higher than 3rd in the Constructors' Championship. The 98T would be the last Lotus to be powered by a Renault engine, and the last to carry the iconic black and gold John Player Special livery. It was also the only season that Johnny Dumfries ever competed in. All 3 would be replaced for 1987. By the time the Lotus Honda 100T debuted in the 1988 season, Ayrton Senna had already jumped ship from McLaren, leaving it in the hands of multiple world champion Nelson Piquet and the less than spectacular Satoru Nakajima. Despite using the exact same turbocharged V6 Honda engine as the dominant McLaren MP4/4, the 100T was little more than an also-ran. Among other things, the car lacked rigidity and couldn't handle the power output of the Honda engine. Whilst it was able to pick up a few podiums, it also managed to pick up a couple of DNQs at the hands of the lackluster Nakajima. The 100T would ultimately prove to be Lotus's last, even moderately successful car. Its predecessor, the 99T, picked up Lotus's last ever championship victories, whilst the 100T picked up the last podiums that Lotus would ever achieve. The team would enter a steady decline, and by 1994 it was a shadow of its former self. Whilst the original Team Lotus was in its death throes, another team that would later be known as Lotus was having its first truly successful season. Benetton, based in Enstone, would take championship glory for the first time with their B194 and driver Michael Schumacher. The B194 was powered by a Ford Cosworth V8 engine, and although this engine was less powerful than the V10s and V12s of its competitors, the car was light and nimble enough to remain competitive, especially in the practiced hands of Schumacher. Schumacher would win 6 of the first 7 races of the 1994 season, giving him a strong lead over his next closest rival, Damon Hill, going into the British Grand Prix. But Schumacher's season would somewhat fall apart at this particular round, as he would earn a disqualification at the British Grand Prix for ignoring black flags, and then another disqualification only 3 rounds later in Belgium for a worn skid block. These 2 DSQs would earn Schumacher a 2-race ban, which allowed Damon Hill to catch up. There would also be other controversies that would strike Benetton that year. The team would be accused of still using launch controls and other electronic driver aids, as such aids had been banned from this season forward. The B194's onboard computers did indeed hold the programming for a launch control, but there was no way to prove that they had ever been used. These days such a thing probably wouldn't be accepted. And then there was what happened at the final round in Australia, with Schumacher and Hill separated by a single point, Schumacher had to win. He had to finish ahead of Damon Hill, and he looked completely in control of the Grand Prix in Adelaide, right up until he made a mistake and went off the track, giving Hill the opportunity to make a crucial overtaking move. And then Schumacher crashed into him, taking them both out of the race and earning Schumacher his first world title in controversial fashion. Regardless of this, Schumacher showed that he had incredible control of the B194, something that none of his teammates could replicate. Schumacher scored all 8 of the car's victories and stood on the podium 2 other times, earning himself 92 points, whilst Jos Verstappen and JJ Leto could only manage an additional 10 points, meaning that despite winning the Drivers' Championship, Benetton could only manage second in the Constructors. For 1995, Benetton managed to secure a customer Renault engine deal, dropping the Ford engine supply they'd been using since 1986. The B195 would be driven yet again by Michael Schumacher and his new teammate Johnny Herbert. The car was very clearly an evolution of the preceding B194, and had likely been designed with a Ford engine in mind. Thus, being coupled with a Renault V10 engine is probably what led to it being seen as such a twitchy car that was only fast when driven on the edge. Most paddock insiders saw the car as inferior to the Williams FW17, a car that had been designed by the now legendary Adrian Newey. But despite all of its issues, the B195 turned out to be the dominating force of the 1995 season, or at least one of the fastest packages. The B195 would take an astonishing 11 wins, 9 at the hands of Schumacher and 2 at the hands of Herbert, with one of those 2 being his home Grand Prix in Great Britain. Benetton spent much of the 1995 season battling with fellow Renault-powered team Williams, seeing the occasional challenge from Ferrari. Whilst Williams put up a good fight, winning 5 Grand Prix of their own, it wouldn't be enough. Schumacher would take the Drivers' Championship at the third to last round at the Pacific Grand Prix, and Benetton would take their first and only Constructors' Championship at the Japanese Grand Prix that followed. After the 1995 season concluded, Schumacher departed the team for Ferrari, taking many of the team's key staff with him. Herbert would also leave, accusing the team of favouritism. In their place, former Ferrari drivers Gerhard Berger and Jean Alesi would drive for the team in 1996, but Benetton would never again reach their heights. The team would win only one more time in the Benetton guise in 1997, but ultimately the team was in decline. In 2001, the Benetton name disappeared from the grid, and in 2002, the Enstone team took on yet another new identity, one that had been on the grid before: Renault. 28 years after Renault first entered Formula 1, the French marque finally took championship glory in 2005, with Fernando Alonso driving the R25 in the final year of the V10s. This was also the Enstone team's first championship since 1995. For 2006, Renault would field the R26, powered by the 2.4-litre V8 engine that would also power Red Bull to championship glory in later years. The R26 had been designed around the revolutionary mass damper. A device normally used to keep buildings stable during earthquakes, it kept the Renault stable during all kinds of manoeuvres, whether it was cornering or even going off track and through grass. This meant that the team would win 7 of the first 9 rounds of the championship, with 6 of those wins at the hands of Alonso and 1 in the hands of his teammate Giancarlo Fisichella. For the 2 rounds that the Renault didn't win, Alonso was always just behind in second. However, the mass damper technology would be banned at the German Grand Prix, and the pace of the car would suffer as a result, as removing the system from a car that had been designed around it proved much more detrimental to their competitors where the system had been added on after the car had already been designed. With the pace of the R26 now lacking, the Ferrari 248 at the hands of Schumacher was able to win 5 of the remaining 7 rounds of the season, and it looked certain that Ferrari would once again win both Drivers' and Constructors' Championships after an off year in 2005. However, an exceptionally rare engine failure for Schumacher would prevent him from winning the Japanese Grand Prix, with Alonso inheriting the victory instead. This all but ended Schumacher and Ferrari's championship hopes, enabling Renault to take their second successive championship double. This, however, would prove to be the high point of Renault's time in Formula 1, unless you count their time as an engine supplier, as with the departure of Alonso in 2007, the team would slump to third. Alonso would return to the team in 2008, taking 2 more victories for the team, which would be the last that the Renault name would take as a constructor. One of those, however, would be the controversial Singapore Grand Prix, the whole Crashgate scandal being far too long to go into. For 2010, Renault introduced the R30, driven by the promising Robert Kubica and the less than promising Vitaly Petrov. The R30 immediately proved to be far more competitive than its predecessor, the R29, especially when it achieved a podium finish in only its second race, something that the R29 only managed to do after 14 rounds. The car would go on to achieve another 2 podiums later that season, including a 3rd place in Monaco at the hands of Kubica. The team would prove to be a strong contender for 4th in the Constructors' Championship. However, the inconsistent Petrov prevented them from finishing any higher than 5th, despite a promising double points finish in the final round in Abu Dhabi. Whilst Kubica finished in the points in all but 1 of the races he finished, Petrov could only score 5 times the entire season. 2010 was still an encouraging year for Renault, who were under new management from Genii Capital, and the team could potentially look forward to brighter days in future. Things did not start very well for Renault's 2011 season. For one thing, it wasn't even really Renault anymore. It was the first incarnation of the new Lotus F1 team, but it was still Renault for legal purposes. And then first driver Robert Kubica suffered a serious injury in a rallying accident, forcing him to spend the rest of the season on the sidelines. He would be replaced by his former teammate Nick Heidfeld, whilst Petrov would stay put. That year's car, the R31, used a distinctive forward-facing exhaust that was planned to improve downforce along the floor, but it proved to not work particularly well, with the car's performance degrading further and further as the season went on. Whilst Heidfeld and Petrov would pick up a podium apiece, they could not replicate that kind of form for the rest of the season, and the team could only finish a disappointing 5th in the Constructors' Championship. The Renault name would cease to be a Formula 1 constructor at the end of the season, making way for a legendary name to return: Lotus. Competing in the 2012 Formula 1 season, the Lotus E20 would be driven by Kimi Räikkönen, Romain Grosjean and Jerome D'Ambrosio. The E20 was far more competitive than either of its predecessors, scoring 303 points across the season and achieving 4th in the Constructors' Championship, making it an extremely solid, if somewhat inconsistent, car. The car would regularly finish on the podium before the summer break, and not just in the hands of the practiced Kimi Räikkönen either. Grosjean would stand on the podium a few times as well, but Grosjean would also earn a race ban for the Italian Grand Prix after it was deemed he caused the first lap crash at the Belgian Grand Prix. Podiums for the E20 also dried up after the summer break, with Räikkönen only standing on the podium twice, the first being a 3rd place in Belgium, and the second being an incredible victory at the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, the first Grand Prix victory that any car under the Lotus name had taken since 1987. It turns out all you had to do was leave Kimi alone. He knew what he was doing. The Lotus E21 was Lotus's 2013 car, once again driven by Kimi Räikkönen and Romain Grosjean. The team would start the season in sensational style when Räikkönen would pick up his 20th Formula 1 victory at the season opener in Australia. The E21 was a very competitive car across the entire season, picking up 13 other podiums, and being a somewhat distant shout for 2nd place in the Constructors, although they would ultimately only finish 4th with 315 points. That 4th place, however, proved to not be enough, as Lotus's contract with Räikkönen had proven to be very costly, as they would pay him a bonus for every point he scored. He scored too many points, and all but bankrupted Lotus, who couldn't afford to pay him. This was one of only a multitude of issues that would start Lotus's decline in Formula 1. 2014 would be yet another season that the Lotus team would see a poor start to, with pre-season testing marred by issues with their new hybrid Renault engines. Not only that, but the twin-tusked E22 was also a fundamentally flawed car. The pace of the E22 never seemed to improve, despite the number of upgrades that were brought to it, and ultimately Lotus decided to end development of the car early to focus on the 2015 car, the E23. The E22 did manage to score 10 points across the season, but that would only be enough to finish 8th in the Constructors' Championship, a far cry from the 315 points and 4th of the previous year. This meant a massive reduction in prize money, which would be coupled with an enormous repair bill, caused by Pastor Maldonado, who had replaced Kimi Räikkönen at the team. The team was truly in the financial dumps by this point, and things were only going to get worse. Competing in the 2015 Formula 1 season, and still driven by Romain Grosjean and Pastor Maldonado, the Lotus E23 would be the first, and so far only, Team Enstone car to not use a Renault engine since 1995. That is, until 2026. The E23 instead used a Mercedes engine, which was hoped to improve the performance of the car, and it did help, as the team would finish 6th in the 2015 Constructors' Championship, and even managed to pick up a single podium at the hands of Romain Grosjean, but this was only after a tyre failure for the Ferrari of Sebastian Vettel. The car was also a far more consistent point scorer to its predecessor, but it wasn't enough to help the team's financial difficulties. With debts mounting, Genii Capital would sell the team back to Renault, who would rebrand Team Enstone back to Renault, kick out both Grosjean and Maldonado, and end the Lotus name's second stint in Formula 1. Competing in the 2016 season and driven by Kevin Magnussen and Jolyon Palmer, the Renault RS16 was the first Renault-badged Formula 1 car to take part in a Formula 1 Grand Prix since 2010, technically. The RS16 was essentially just an evolution of the previous year's Lotus E23, and it showed. The car had originally been built for a Mercedes engine and struggled to be adapted to the Renault engine. The car was pretty much a backmarker for the entire season, only scoring points a handful of times, with Magnussen scoring a 7th place and a 10th place, and Palmer scoring a single 10th. Renault ended development of the car by July of that year, electing to focus more on the 2017 car instead. Thus, the team would only score 8 points upon its return, only enough for 9th in the Constructors' Championship, but it was a year that they had written off, and they were about to start their 100 race 5-year plan to become champions again. Competing in the 2017 F1 season, the Renault RS17 would be driven by Nico Hülkenberg, Jolyon Palmer and Carlos Sainz Jr. This would be the first all-Renault car since the Enstone team was reacquired by the French marque, and it showed significant progress over its predecessor. Whilst it was still an inconsistent scorer and never achieved a double points finish, the RS17 was at least a consistent enough car to finish 6th in the Constructors' Championship, a respectable result for the team that had been simply nowhere the year before. The vast majority of the car's points would be scored by Hülkenberg, with Palmer failing to score until round 14 in Singapore. He would be replaced only 2 rounds later by Carlos Sainz, who scored P7 on his Renault debut, but then failed to score for the rest of the season from then on. One small part of the RS17 gained its own little cult following, a barge board on the side of the car that gained the nickname Aerocat due to its shape. The Renault RS18 would be yet another improvement over its predecessor. Whilst the RS17 had been an inconsistent point scorer, the RS18 was a consistent point scorer. The RS18 would more often than not be scoring double points finishes, even as its pace dropped off towards the end of the season. It proved to be one of the strongest midfield packages on the grid that year, performing better than the Haas VF18 and the Force India VJM11. The car rarely finished in the top 5, however, owing to the top 3 teams holding a monopoly, but it did manage 2 5th-place finishes as its best result of the season, 1 apiece to each of its drivers. Renault was clearly improving and looked on track to join the top 3 and start challenging for championships within the next couple of years. Things were looking up for Renault, but not for driver Carlos Sainz, who would be replaced the next year by former Red Bull driver Daniel Ricciardo. Ricciardo would partner Nico Hülkenberg driving the RS19 in the 2019 Formula 1 season. Unlike previous seasons where they had been constantly improving, Renault instead stagnated, and if anything, fell a little behind. The team struggled with the car's pace for the entire first half of the season, only managing to pick up 39 points before the summer break. The The car struggled mainly at circuits that required a lot of downforce, but at power circuits it was usually best of the rest, finishing well in Canada and scoring the best results of its season at the Italian Grand Prix, with 4th and 5th. The team had been languishing in 6th before that, but afterwards they were finally in 5th, where they would finish the season. There were plenty of downsides to their 2019 season: a double disqualification in Japan owing to their innovative brake system, and a potential podium for Hülkenberg being thrown away when he made a mistake in the waterlogged German Grand Prix. Daniel Ricciardo would be partnered by Esteban Ocon to drive the RS20, but it would be the last Renault that Ricciardo would drive. He had already lost confidence in the team and had announced he would leave the team before the season had even begun. The RS20 was a much improved car over its predecessor, but its improvements were too little, too late, as McLaren and Racing Point had made enough gains to overtake the French squad. The RS20 was nonetheless a consistent scorer and often threatened the podium positions. Eventually, it did finish on the podium, twice at the hands of Ricciardo, with a 3rd place at the Eiffel and Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix, and Esteban Ocon would have finished 2nd at the incredible Sakir Grand Prix. The RS20 would be the last car to wear the Renault badge as a constructor. Team Enstone would yet again be rebranded, this time to Renault's supercars division, Alpine. The newly rebranded Alpine squad fielded a modified Renault RS20 for the 2021 season, renamed the A521. Other changes to the squad included the sacking of Ciro Abiteboul as team principal, and the departing Daniel Ricciardo was replaced with 2-time Renault champion Fernando Alonso. The A521's striking blue and red livery didn't help it to secure particularly good results. It was yet again just another midfield car, and the team's 100 race plan was clearly falling apart. On their way to securing yet another 5th place in the Constructors' Championship, the Alpine squad did manage to secure 2 podiums. Alonso would achieve his first podium in Formula 1 since 2014, whilst Ocon would take an unexpected victory at the Hungarian Grand Prix, battling all race long with the Aston Martin of Sebastian Vettel. This is to date the most recent Grand Prix victory by Team Enstone. The team is still waiting for its next. Alpine would retain Alonso and Ocon for the 2022 season to drive the A522 together, which would have the first Renault engine to use a split turbo concept. The team also gained a new team principal, Otmar Szafnauer, joining from Aston Martin. However, there were some early signs of friction within the team. Ocon and Alonso would battle for much of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, which, whilst it gave them a lot of screen time, was not something that the team wanted to see. The relationship between the two drivers had more or less completely broken down by the time of the Hungarian Grand Prix, when Ocon almost caused Alonso to crash, with the incident prompting Alonso to make the call to leave the team and join Aston Martin instead. As for the A522, it was a decent and acceptable car, though it was unable to secure a podium finish like its two predecessors. The team managed to finish 4th in the Constructors' Championship with 173 points, ahead of McLaren, who had fallen behind, but one wonders if Daniel Ricciardo had managed to score a few more points for McLaren, and maybe Alpine would have finished 5th yet again.
Our best lap so far is a 1 minute 31.9.
Alpine's 2023 season began to go wrong during the 2022 season. When Alonso announced he would be leaving the team, Alpine almost immediately announced that Academy driver Oscar Piastri would take his place, only for Piastri to then rebuke their claims and say that he didn't have a contract, and that he would be driving elsewhere for 2023. That meant that Alpine had to look for a new driver, and they settled on Frenchman Pierre Gasly to partner Esteban Ocon, a partnership that could absolutely not go wrong. Together they would drive the A523, which was yet another step back from its predecessor. The team had gone through about 5 100-race plans and 2 5-year plans by the time that this car hit the track, and not one of them was working. The car simply wasn't performing well enough. Sure, it was working well enough to finish 6th in the Constructors, but that was worse than 4th the previous year, and 5th the 3 previous seasons before that. So halfway through the Belgian Grand Prix weekend, they decided to fire Otmar Szafnauer, because clearly it was his fault and not the team's. The two teammates, meanwhile, were making the most of their horrific relationship and crashed each other out at least twice during the season. There were a couple of high points, however. Ocon did manage to finish 3rd at the Monaco Grand Prix, which was followed by another 3rd place for Gasly at the Dutch Grand Prix. It was an extremely unremarkable season for Alpine, with the French squad only able to achieve 120 points and a very lonely 6th place in the Constructors' Championship. They had been outdeveloped by McLaren, who had been nowhere at the start of the season but were regularly scoring podiums towards the end, whilst the car was clearly better than 7th placed Williams. Some might have called it a solid season, but it was a sign of things to come. The team clearly wasn't moving upwards, but they could still move backwards. Alpine fielded the A524 for the 2024 season, a season that began very poorly for the team before the season had even begun, because the car failed crash tests. As such, the car had to be reinforced, which made it much heavier than the minimum weight requirements. In addition, its Renault engine was underpowered, so it was slow and heavy. It was comfortably the worst car at the start of the season, locking out the last row of the grid at the season opening Bahrain Grand Prix. However, the team did make strides in improving the car, fitting it with several upgrades as the season went on, and it did start turning into a semi-regular points scorer, though it was usually only the dregs of the points, 9th and 10th places. By the time the Sao Paulo Grand Prix in Brazil rolled around, the team was sitting in 9th place in the Constructors' Championship. The team brought along their best upgrade yet, with Gasly managing to finish the sprint in P7, the best result that an Alpine car had achieved all season so far. But then in the Grand Prix, things completely turned around, where a red flag allowed the team to change the tyres of their cars without actually having a pit stop, a rule that remains controversial. The two Alpine cars had been running in first and second at the time of the red flag, which became second and third only moments after the restart. The two Alpines managed to hold on to their position during the wet race and managed to finish P2 and P3, a position that the A524 simply didn't deserve. This undeserved double podium jumped the team from 9th place to 6th place in the Constructors, and made it seem as though their season actually went rather well, when it didn't. The A524 was an unmitigated piece of shit, only better than the Sauber. Towards the end of the season, the team would re-sign their old team boss Flavio Briatore, who decided that the Renault engines no longer cut it anymore, and in 2026, Renault engines will leave the sport for potentially the last time, with Alpine switching to Mercedes power instead for Renault.